day my father looked at me in open court and said I was a clerical mistake from 30 years ago, I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, really looked at him and thought, you have no idea what you just did. Let me back up. I grew up in Claremont, Ohio. Small town. The kind of place where everybody knows your business before you do. My father was a contractor, built half the houses on the east side of town, drove a truck with his name on the door, coached Little League in the summers. People respected him, waved at him in parking lots, called him by his first name at the hardware store. His name was Gerald. To me, for most of my life, he was just Dad. My mother's name was Lynn. She was quiet, where he was loud, careful, where he was careless, and she loved me in the way that some mothers love, completely, without conditions, without keeping score. She made my lunches with little notes tucked inside. She sat at the kitchen table with me when I had nightmares. She drove me 2 hours to Columbus every Saturday morning for 3 years so I could take the advanced chemistry program at Ohio State's Youth Academy. Because she said she'd rather wear out the car than let me wear out my potential. My parents' marriage ended when I was 9. Not with a bang, more like a slow leak, the kind you don't notice until the tire is flat and you're already stranded. My father moved out in October, married a woman named, I'll call her my stepmother, because that's what she was, legally, by the following spring. I remember thinking that was very fast. I was 9. I didn't have the vocabulary for what I was feeling, but I knew something had been decided about me without anyone asking. After that, I stayed with my mother. My father paid child support, technically. He showed up for some birthdays. He came to my high school graduation and stood next to his wife and their 2 sons, my half-brothers, and he put his arm around my shoulder for a photo and smiled like everything was normal, like there was nothing strange about the fact that I had called his house twice that spring to tell him I'd been accepted to Northwestern on a full academic scholarship, and both times his wife had answered and told me he'd call me back. He never called back. I went to Northwestern anyway. Pre-med, then medical school at the University of Chicago, then a residency in general surgery at Johns Hopkins, then a fellowship in hepatobiliary surgery, liver, gallbladder, bile ducts at the Cleveland Clinic. I was 31 years old when my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. I drove home to Claremont that weekend. I sat with her in the living room of the house I grew up in, the house my father had built with his own hands, incidentally, and then walked away from, and she held my hands and told me not to worry. She said she had good doctors. She said she had made sure her affairs were in order, just in case, because she was that kind of woman. I set up a trust, she told me. Years ago, you're the beneficiary. Everything, the house, the savings, the investments, it's all yours when the time comes. I told her the time wasn't coming anytime soon. She smiled. Let's hope not. My mother fought hard. 2 years of chemotherapy, 1 surgery, a second surgery, a clinical trial that bought us another 8 months. I flew home as often as I could. When I couldn't fly home, I called every day. Sometimes twice. I learned to read her voice the way I'd learned to read a patient's chart, listening for what wasn't being said. The pauses. The way she'd change the subject when something was hurting. She died on a Tuesday morning in March. I was with her. I won't describe that morning. Some things belong only to the people who were there. What I will say is this. The week after her funeral, I got a call from an attorney I'd never heard of, representing my father whom I had not spoken to in 4 years. My father, who had not attended my mother's funeral. My father, whose attorney was now informing me, in the careful, flat language that lawyers use when they're saying something outrageous and wanted to sound routine, that my father was contesting my mother's trust. His argument, and I want you to understand that I'm not paraphrasing, this is what the attorney actually said, was that the trust had been established during the marriage, using assets that were partially marital property. and that my mother had never properly relinquished his interest in those assets in the divorce settlement. Therefore, he had a claim. And furthermore, and this is the part that made me sit down on my kitchen floor with my coat still on, he was arguing that I lacked standing to be a beneficiary because I was, and I quote from the actual legal filing, a dependent of the marriage, not a recognized individual party to the marital estate, a dependent of the marriage, not a person, not his daughter. A line item. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Renata. She has been practicing estate and trust litigation in Illinois for 22 years. When I read her the filing over the phone, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very calmly, "Well, that's creative." Then she said, "They're going to regret this." The hearing was scheduled for late May in probate court in Knox County, Ohio, the county where my mother had lived. I drove down the night before and stayed in a motel off the interstate. I remember lying in that motel bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about my mother, thinking about all those Saturday morning drives to Columbus, thinking about the lunch notes, thinking about the look on her face at my medical school graduation, the way she pressed both hands over her mouth when they called my name, like she couldn't hold in everything she was feeling. I thought about what it would mean to let my father win. I decided I wouldn't. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, a gallery with about 15 seats, most of them empty. My father sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a man named Cutler, very pressed suit, very confident posture, and his wife beside him. She was wearing a blazer. She looked like she'd already won. I sat at the other table with Renata. My father glanced at me when I came in, just once. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. More like recalibration. Like he was trying to figure out what version of me had walked through the door. I was wearing my hospital badge. I hadn't planned it that way. I'd driven straight from a consult in Columbus and hadn't thought to take it off. But there it was, clipped to my jacket. My photo, my name, and below that, attending surgeon, hepatobiliary surgery. The judge came in. Her name was the Honorable Constance Arroyo. She was somewhere in her 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular stillness of someone who has seen every variety of human foolishness and is no longer surprised by any of it. Cutler stood up and began making his opening statement. He had clearly practiced it. He talked about marital assets and community property principles and equitable distribution. He used the phrase administrative classification 3 times. He called me, at one point, the contingent dependent designee, which is a way of saying my name while making it sound like a filing error. My father nodded along like he was in church. When Cutler was done, Judge Arroyo looked at Renata. Renata stood up and said, very simply, that the trust had been established with post-divorce earnings and assets, that the divorce settlement had been fully adjudicated and was not subject to reopening under Ohio statute, and that the petitioner, meaning me, was the named beneficiary and the biological daughter of the deceased, with full standing under Ohio law to receive the trust assets. Then Renata sat down. Judge Arroyo looked at my father's table. She looked at Cutler. Then she looked at the paperwork in front of her, and she took her glasses off and she said, in that particular quiet voice that I would learn means she is about to say something important. Counsel. Cutler stood up. Your Honor, your client characterizes the petitioner as, she looked down at the paper, an administrative designation arising from the original marital contract with no independent standing in the estate. That's correct, Your Honor. She looked at him over her glasses. Does your client know what his daughter does for a living? Cutler blinked. I'm not sure what that has to do with, humor me. There was a pause. Cutler turned and murmured something to my father. My father said something back. Cutler turned to the judge. She's a physician, Your Honor, of some kind. Judge Arroyo looked at me. I held very still. She said, I ask because I recognized her name when I read the filing. Doctor, and she said my name, my full name, The name my mother gave me is the surgeon who operated on my husband 14 months ago. Cholangiocarcinoma. Bile duct cancer. Median survival rate of 6 to 18 months. He is currently in remission. The room was completely silent. My father had gone the color of old paper. Judge Arroyo put her glasses back on. I want to be clear that I have no personal bias in this matter, and am prepared to rule on the merits of the case alone. She paused. But I do think it is worth noting, for the record, that the woman your client is describing as an administrative error is a surgeon whose work is recognized at a national level, who gave my husband the chance to walk our daughter down the aisle last fall. Another pause. Proceed, counsel. Cutler looked like he wanted to be somewhere, anywhere else. My father's wife put her hand on his arm. He didn't look at her. Renata presented the trust documents. The original filing date, 8 years after the divorce was finalized. The assets my mother's savings account opened in her name alone. Her 401k entirely funded after the divorce. The house, which had been refinanced and retitled in her name. Not one asset had originated during the marriage. Not one. Cutler tried to cross-examine. He asked about a joint savings account from 1997. Renata pointed out that account had been closed and the funds distributed in the divorce settlement on a date she cited exactly, referencing the page number in the settlement agreement. He asked about the house. She pointed out that my mother had held the mortgage alone for 23 years. He asked about an investment account. She showed the court that it had been opened in 2004, 6 years after the divorce. Every door Cutler tried, Renata had already locked. At one point, Judge Arroyo looked up from the documents and said, very quietly, "Counsel, are you aware that Ohio statute does not permit reopening a finalized divorce settlement under these circumstances without clear and convincing evidence of fraud or misrepresentation at the time of the original filing?" Cutler said he was. "And are you prepared to present that evidence?" A long pause. "No, Your Honor." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at her papers. "I watched her write something. I'm going to take a 15-minute recess," she said. "When we come back, I expect you to advise your client on the realistic outcome of proceeding." She stood. We all stood. She walked out. Renata leaned toward me and said very quietly, "It's over." I looked at my father. For the first time since I'd walked in, I let myself really look at him. He was 63 years old. His hair had gone white. He had the hands of a man who had worked hard his whole life, rough palms, thick knuckles, and he was staring at the table in front of him the way people stare at things when they're trying not to have to look anywhere else. His wife was talking to him in a low, urgent voice. I couldn't hear what she was saying. I thought about all the calls I had not received back. I thought about his name on the door of his truck, the way the whole town knew him, the way he smiled in that graduation photo. I thought about the word administrative. I thought about my mother, alone in that house, driving me to Columbus every Saturday, writing notes on napkins and tucking them into my lunch. I thought, she won. She already won. She made me, and I am here, and there is nothing he can do about that. When we came back from the recess, Cutler informed the court that his client was withdrawing the challenge. Judge Arroyo acknowledged this. She awarded legal fees to the respondent, meaning me. She said the trust would proceed to distribution as written. Then she looked directly at me, not at the table, at me. And she said, "I hope you know what your work means, doctor." And she said my name again. "People like my husband get to see their grandchildren because of surgeons like you." I said, "Thank you, Your Honor." That was all. Outside the courthouse in the parking lot, the sun was doing that thing Ohio sun does in late May. Gold and a little brutal, the kind of light that doesn't leave you anywhere to hide. I stood by my car with my keys in my hand. My father came out a few minutes later. He stopped maybe 10 feet away from me. His wife stayed back near the door. He looked at me for a long moment. I waited. He said, "I didn't know she was sick." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't know it was that bad." I said, I didn't know it was that bad. I said, I know. He said, I should have. And then he stopped. He pressed his hand over his mouth, briefly, the way people do when they're trying to get control of something. He looked away, out of the parking lot, at nothing in particular. I had thought about this moment a lot, in the motel the night before. In the car on the drive down, I had thought about what I would say, what I wanted from him, whether I had anything left to give. I said, she loved you. For a long time, she really loved you. And she loved me enough to make sure I never needed anything from anyone who didn't want to give it. That's what the trust was. That was her taking care of me one last time. He didn't say anything. I'm not angry, I told him. And I meant it. Not as forgiveness, not as absolution, just as a fact. I was tired. I was 31 years old and I was tired, and I had patients to get back to, and my mother was gone, and there was nothing left in that parking lot that needed anything from me. I got in my car. I drove back to Columbus. I had a consult at 4 o'clock, a man in his mid-50s with a tumor in his common bile duct, recently diagnosed, sitting in a room somewhere in the hospital waiting for a doctor to come in and tell him what his options were. I washed my hands and put on my white coat, and I walked into that room and I sat down across from him and his wife, and I looked at them both, and I said, here's what we are going to do. Because that is what I do. That is what my mother drove me 2 hours every Saturday to become. That is what she saved and scrimped and held on and believed in and left behind for me in every way she knew how. My father called me a clerical mistake. My mother called me her greatest accomplishment. I know which one got it right. I've thought a lot about why my father did what he did. Not because I'm still angry, I'm not, but because I think understanding it matters. For a long time I wanted a clean villain, someone I could point to and say, there, that's the problem, that's the person who broke something. But the longer I've sat with it, the more I think my father wasn't a villain. He was just a man who made choices and then spent 30 years not looking at what those choices cost. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody tells you when you're young. It doesn't always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it shows up in a courtroom in Knox County, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning in May, when a judge takes her glasses off and says your daughter's name like it means something, because it does. My mother understood this, not in a dramatic way. She wasn't a woman who talked about what goes around comes around, or about getting what you deserve. She was more practical than that. What she believed, what she showed me every Saturday morning drive, every lunch note, every dollar she saved and invested and put in that trust, was that the only answer to being underestimated is to become undeniable. Not to prove anyone wrong, not for revenge, just to become so fully and completely yourself that the people who dismissed you no longer have the power to define you. She was right. I didn't walk into that courtroom to humiliate my father. I walked in because my mother had made sure I had something worth protecting, and I was going to protect it. The judge recognizing my name. That wasn't a weapon I planned to use. It was just the truth of my life showing up in the room. Everything I had built, every early morning and late night and hard case and harder decision had accumulated into a person that other people knew. Not because I'd engineered it that way, because I had shown up fully every single day. That's what I want to say about integrity. Not the word, the practice of it. Integrity isn't something you perform when people are watching. It's what you do in the operating room at 11 o'clock at night when you're tired and the case is going long and the person on that table has no idea how much it matters that you stay sharp, stay careful, stay present. Nobody gives you credit for that. But it compounds. It adds up into something real, into a life that can stand up in a room and not need anyone to vouch for it. And resilience. My mother had it in the way that quiet people sometimes do. Not loud, not dramatic, just relentless. She didn't collapse when my father left. She didn't stop. She worked, and she saved, and she drove me to Columbus, and she sat with me at the kitchen table, and she made sure I knew I was worth investing in. That resilience was a gift she gave me without naming it. I didn't know what to call it until I was in medical school, pushing through a stretch of months that felt impossible, and I realized I had never learned how to quit. She hadn't let me. Not because she was hard on me, because she believed in me hard enough that giving up never felt like an option. My father called me a clerical mistake. He meant it to diminish me. What it actually did was show me, one last time, exactly who he was, and confirm that I had never needed him to be anything different. My mother had already given me everything I needed. She just did it quietly, over 30 years, one Saturday morning at a time. I think about that whenever a case is hard, whenever something feels like too much. I think, Lynn drove 2 hours every Saturday so you could be here. Don't waste it. I don't.